I was a corrections officer for 15 years. 15 years walking the same cold, gray lines on the steel tiers, breathing in recycled air so thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and the sour odor of despair you could practically taste it on your tongue. It was a world compressed. A concrete box of simmering rage and quiet desperation were the only things that changed with the faces, and even those started to look the same after a while. I was used to disrespect. It's basically part of the uniform, an invisible stain you can't wash out. You expect it from the inmates, of course. It's the currency of their survival, a way to carve out a sliver of power in a powerless existence. But sometimes, more often than you'd think, you get it from the polished shoe lawyers who stroll in, their briefcases swinging like pendulums of judgment, thinking their law degrees make them better than the guy holding the keys to the cage. I'd seen it all, or so I thought. The hollow-point threats whispered through a cell door slot, the hurled insults that were as predictable as chow time, the 1,000-yard stares from men whose souls had checked out long before their bodies arrived. None of it ever got to me. You learn to build a wall inside yourself, brick by meticulous brick, mortared with cynicism and emotional distance, until you think you're untouchable, an unbreachable fortress of professional calm. I was a good officer because I didn't feel. I observed, I reacted, I enforced. It was that simple. But when an inmate's lawyer, a man whose suit probably cost more than my car, laughed directly in my face, it wasn't his casual arrogance that got under my skin. It wasn't the condescending, self-satisfied smirk that seemed permanently affixed to his lips. It was the sudden, shocking transformation of the man standing right next to me. The deputy warden. My boss, a man with a reputation as hard and unyielding as the concrete walls around us, went pale. Not just nervous pale, not the flush of irritation. This was the ghastly, blood-drained color of pure, raw fear. And in that one silent, suspended moment, the wall I'd spent 15 years constructing didn't just crack, it crumbled into dust. That was the moment my life, a life defined by routine and control, took a hard left turn into the unknown. It was the moment I stopped being just a guard, a cog in the machine, and became something else entirely. A hunter in a jungle made of steel and stone, where the most dangerous predators aren't always the ones locked in cages. The lawyer's name was Adrian Thorne. He was the kind of guy who looked like he was born in a tailored courtroom suit, with a silver tongue, a shark smile, and the unnerving ability to make you feel small without raising his voice. His client was an inmate named Silas Black. Now, Silas wasn't your typical con. He wasn't a gangbanger covered in territorial ink or a twitchy street-level dealer. He was a white-collar criminal, a former hedge fund manager doing a soft 10 years for a massive fraud scheme that had vaporized the pensions of hundreds of people. He was quiet, almost unnaturally so, calculating, and carried himself with an unnerving calm that was more intimidating than any overt display of aggression. He rarely had visitors, but when he did, it was always Thorne, gliding through security with an air of entitled impatience. That day, the visit was scheduled in one of the private conference rooms we saved for attorney-client meetings, a small, sterile box with a table, 3 chairs, and a reinforced window looking out onto a brick wall. My job was simple: escort Silas from his cell in the minimum security wing, do the initial check-in at the conference room door, and then leave them to their privileged conversation. As fate would have it, Deputy Warden Evans was doing a walk-through of the admin wing and, to my surprise, decided to observe the handoff. It was highly unusual for him to take a personal interest in such a routine visit, but Evans was a notorious stickler for procedure, a man who lived by the book. His presence added a layer of formal tension to the air. The check-in was by the numbers. The formal ID confirmation, a standard pat-down. Silas was compliant as always, his eyes distant and unreadable. Just as I was about to secure the door and leave them to it, Thorne, with a theatrical little flourish, slid a thick manila envelope across the table to Silas. Standard procedure. Legal documents can be exchanged, but they have to be inspected for contraband first. I held out my gloved hand, my voice flat, professional, automatic. "I need to see that, Mr. Thorne." Thorne pulled it back just an inch, a calculated smirk playing on his lips. "It's privileged legal material, officer. Attorney-client confidentiality. You know the rules." "And the rules," I shot back, my patience already thinning, "say I check it for contraband. I don't read it. I just fan it to make sure there's no cash, no SIM cards, no razor blades hidden between the pages." He let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound that didn't belong in the tense, muffled quiet of a prison. It was the sound of dismissal, of someone swatting away a fly. "Don't you have bigger fish to fry, officer?" Like making sure nobody's sharpening a toothbrush into a shiv. My jaw tightened, a hot flush of anger rising up my neck. The comment was perfectly crafted to put me in my place, to remind me that I was just the help. I was about to fire back a reply, something sharp and insubordinate, but I caught myself and glanced at D.W. Evans. I expected him to step in, to assert his authority and put this smug lawyer in his place. He was the deputy warden, after all. But he didn't. Evans was just staring. His normally ruddy, weathered face had lost all its color. His eyes were wide, glued not to me or to Thorne, but to the simple manila envelope in Thorne's hand. He looked like he'd seen a ghost walk through the wall. Then, Evans gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It wasn't a gesture for Thorne, it was a clear, unambiguous signal directed at me. "Let it go. Stand down." A wave of confusion washed over me. The air in that little room was suddenly crackling with a strange, new tension that had nothing to do with the usual inmate-guard dynamic. This was different, something alien. Reluctantly, my training and instincts screaming in protest, I dropped my hand. "Fine," I muttered, my voice tight with a frustration I couldn't begin to understand. Thorne's smirk widened into a triumphant grin. He slid the envelope the rest of the way to Silas, who took it without a word, his expression as blank and placid as ever. I turned on my heel and left the room, the heavy lock clicking shut behind me with the finality of a gunshot. When I looked down the hall, Evans was already halfway down it, moving fast, his broad shoulders hunched as if against a cold wind. He never looked back. For the rest of my 14-hour shift, I couldn't shake it. The laugh, the casual disrespect, that was just noise, the background static of the job. But the look on Evans' face, that was a signal. A deep, terrifying crack in the facade of order and authority that we lived and breathed every single day. A deputy warden doesn't get spooked by a lawyer. They just don't. And as I replayed that single bizarre moment in my head over and over, the condescending laugh, the bloodless face, the silent command to back down, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I had just witnessed something I was never supposed to see. That envelope wasn't just paper. And the fear in Evans' eyes wasn't about a minor breach of protocol. It was about something much, much worse. The days that followed were a masterclass in paranoia. Every routine conversation felt loaded with hidden meaning. Every casual glance from a supervisor felt like a warning shot across my bow. I tried to reason with myself, to file the incident away. Maybe Evans was sick. Maybe he was having personal problems. A bad day that had nothing to do with work. But I'd worked in this pressure cooker for 15 years. I know the difference between stress and pure, unadulterated terror. And what I saw etched on his face was terror. My curiosity quickly curdled into an obsession, a dangerous one. In a place like this, curiosity is a liability. It gets you transferred to the night shift in the worst cell block, it gets you fired on a trumped-up charge, or worse. But I couldn't let it go. It was like a loose thread on a pristine uniform. You pull it, not knowing if you're fixing a minor flaw or unraveling the whole damn thing. I decided to pull. I started small, discreetly. I spent my next few breaks in the records room, a dusty, neglected office in the basement that smelled of old paper, mildew, and stale coffee. I told the clerk, a weary man named Henderson who had been there since the Stone Age, that I was double-checking some of my escort logs for an overtime claim, a believable and mind-numbingly boring lie. Once he'd shuffled back to his crossword puzzle, I looked up the visitor logs for Silas Black. Most inmates see their lawyer once a month, maybe twice if a big appeal is coming up. Thorne was visiting Silas 3, sometimes 4 times a week. Many of the visits were logged outside normal hours, a special privilege that required senior approval. For a guy whose case was closed, whose appeals were exhausted. It was unheard of. What legal strategy could possibly require such urgent, frequent meetings? Next, I turned my attention to Silas himself. His institutional file was remarkably thin for a supposed financial mastermind. He was a model inmate. No disciplinary write-ups, no fights, no contraband charges. He worked in the prison library, a cushy, sought-after job. He kept to himself. But one thing snagged my attention: his commissary account. On the surface, it looked perfectly normal. A modest balance, small weekly deposits from a designated family member. It was clean. Too clean. That's when I decided to call in a favor for my friend, Dave, another CO who worked the mailroom. He owed me for covering a shift when his kid was sick. I caught him in the break room, stirring a packet of sugar into his coffee. "Dave," I started, keeping my voice low and casual. "I need you to do something for me. Off the books." He looked wary, his eyes darting around the empty room. "What's up, Mark? Everything okay? Keep an eye on the mail for Silas Black. Specifically, anything that looks like a money order." Dave frowned, confused. "His commissary? That's all handled by electronic transfer now. Has been for years." "Exactly," I said, meeting his gaze. "Which is why it'd be weird if he was getting physical money orders, right? Just keep your eyes open." 2 long, uneventful weeks went by. The paranoia began to fade, replaced by the nagging feeling that I was chasing ghosts, that I'd built a conspiracy out of a bad day and a rude lawyer. Then, one evening, Dave flagged me down as I was clocking out, his face pale and his hands fidgeting. He pulled me into an empty storage closet, the air thick with the smell of floor wax and bleach. "You're not gonna believe this," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he held up a small stack of money orders. They weren't addressed to Silas. They were made out to 3 other inmates, all in different blocks, all with different security levels. The sender's name was different on each one, but the tidy, precise handwriting was identical. The return address on all of them was the same P.O. box in a neighboring state. "So why are you showing me these?" I asked, my heart starting to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "Because," Dave said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system, "they all came inside a single legal mail package. A package addressed to Silas Black. From his lawyer, Adrian Thorne." My blood ran cold. Legal mail is sacred. It's a protected channel of communication, a cornerstone of the justice system. It's also the perfect Trojan horse. Thorne wasn't just bringing in legal documents. He was using the shield of attorney-client privilege to funnel money orders to other inmates, using Silas as the internal hub. But why? Electronic deposits leave a clear, undeniable digital trail. This method was messy, convoluted, and deliberately hard to trace back to a single source. It was a classic money laundering technique, just ingeniously adapted for the inside of a prison. Silas wasn't Thorne's client. He was his banker, a quiet, unassuming distribution center for making payments inside the prison walls. Payments for what? Contraband was the obvious answer. Drugs, phones, weapons. But this felt bigger, more intricate. The inmates receiving the money had no obvious connection to each other. It was too complex for just a few bags of weed or a handful of burner phones. And it still didn't explain the deputy warden. Why would a man who ran the entire facility be terrified of a smuggling ring? Scared of it being exposed on his watch? It would be a black eye on his record, a professional embarrassment, for sure. But abject terror? The kind that drains the very blood from your face? No. That didn't add up. That night, sleep wasn't an option. The pieces were swirling in my mind, refusing to settle, forming a dark, ugly, and incomplete picture. Thorne, the smug delivery boy. Silas, the quiet inside man. And Evans, the terrified superior. I was no longer just pulling a loose thread. I felt like I had my hand on a thick, heavy rope, and it was leading me down into a darkness I never knew existed within the very walls I was paid to guard. I had to know where it ended. My investigation had slammed into a brick wall. I knew Thorne was funneling money to Silas to pay off other inmates. A sophisticated contraband ring was a solid theory, but it felt incomplete. It was a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. It didn't account for the sheer, soul-deep terror on Deputy Warden Evans's face. A scandal is a headache. This was something else entirely. This was a man staring into an abyss. I needed to go deeper, beyond visitor logs and mailroom tricks. I needed access to the prison's core financial records, the digital ledger that tracked every dollar that moved within the institution. This was a massive, career-ending risk. Poking around visitor logs is one thing, Trying to get into sensitive financial data without authorization could get me fired and very possibly prosecuted. My only way in was a woman named Maria. She was a civilian employee, a quiet accountant in her late 50s who'd been running the prison's accounting office for over 20 years. To most of us in uniform, she was just part of the background, invisible. But I had made a point of being kind to her over the years. Simple things, "Good morning, Maria," asking about her grandkids, holding a door. I was banking on that small, accumulated bit of goodwill being worth more than her fear of breaking the rules. I found her after hours, tidying her desk and getting ready to leave. "Maria," I said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Worry crossed her face instantly. In our world, a guard seeking out an accountant after hours usually meant bad news. "Mark, what's wrong?" "I hope nothing," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I have a concern about some potential financial irregularities. I think an inmate might be running a scheme, and I need to look at some records to confirm or deny it. But I have to do this very, very quietly." I could see the conflict warring in her eyes. Her loyalty was to the system, to the rules she had followed for 2 decades. But she also trusted me. I laid out a small, carefully edited piece of what I knew: the strange, frequent visits from the lawyer, the suspicion of money being moved around in an unusual way. I strategically left Thorne's and, more importantly, Evans's names out of it. She was silent for a long time, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "What records do you need?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Inmate fund transfer logs for the last 6 months. And the full transaction history for a few specific inmate accounts." She let out a heavy sigh, the sound of someone making a decision they knew they might regret. "Give me the inmate numbers. Come back tomorrow, an hour after lockdown. Use the back entrance. And Mark, be careful. This place has a way of swallowing people who start asking too many questions." The next night, the main office was dark and silent, the air still and cool. The only light came from the green glow of a single monitor on Maria's desk. She had a stack of printouts waiting for me. "You have 1 hour," she said, her expression grim as she retreated to the far side of the room, turning her back to give me plausible deniability. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the first page. I started with the inmates from Dave's money orders. Their accounts showed exactly what I expected: a series of small, untraceable deposits, followed by immediate, full-balance transfers to other inmates. It was a confusing, chaotic web of microtransactions, designed to be impossible to follow. But when I cross-referenced the names of the recipients, there was still no discernible pattern. They weren't in the same gang, didn't share work details, weren't from the same cell blocks. It wasn't a drug network. This was something else. Frustrated, I pulled up the main file Maria had left for me: the complete financial ledger for the entire institution. It was thousands of lines of dense, coded data. I wasn't an accountant, but after 15 years in a bureaucracy, I knew how to look for anomalies, for things that didn't fit. My eyes scanned the pages, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. And then I saw it: a recurring series of transactions labeled programmatic reallocations. These weren't small amounts. These were huge sums, tens of thousands of dollars at a time, being moved from the general budget, money earmarked for maintenance, for inmate education programs, for staff overtime, into obscure, vaguely named sub-accounts. From there, the money was scattered like digital dust, disguised as payments for non-existent services, phantom vendors, and ghost employees. It was a breathtakingly sophisticated embezzlement scheme, siphoning public funds straight into a black hole. But the most damning part: the authorization. Every single one of these massive transfers required a high-level signature for approval, a digital key held by only a few senior staff. And on every single one of those fraudulent transactions, I saw the same name, the same digital signature: Deputy Warden Evans. This was it. The reason for the fear. This was why he went pale. It wasn't about a lawyer or some inmate smuggling ring. It was grand-scale theft, happening right under my nose. The money Thorne was bringing in through Silas wasn't to buy things inside the prison. It was the payout. The kickbacks for the inmates whose accounts were being used to launder the stolen public money before it disappeared. Silas, the quiet financial wizard, was the architect of the internal system. Thorne, the slick lawyer, was the bagman, moving the cash on the outside. And Evans. Evans was the authority, the linchpin who made it all possible with his signature. But he wasn't the mastermind. The terror on his face that day told me that. A man in charge doesn't look like that. A man who's trapped, who's being blackmailed, who knows he's a disposable piece in a much larger game, he looks like that. Evans was a pawn, a high-ranking one with a key to the treasury, but still just a pawn. Someone else was turning the lock. This wasn't just a few bad apples. This was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the prison's administration. I looked over at Maria, who was watching me, her face etched with worry. I slid the papers back into the folder, my hands now steady. "Thank you, Maria," I said, my voice hoarse. "You didn't see me here." Walking back to my car in the cold night air, the full weight of what I'd found settled on me like a concrete shroud. I had thought I was pulling on a loose thread, but I had just ripped a gaping hole in the very fabric of the institution I worked for. And I knew, with a chilling and absolute certainty, that the people behind this wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatened to expose them. My secret investigation was over. A war was about to begin. The days that followed were the longest and most harrowing of my life. They say knowledge is power. For me, it was a slow-acting poison. Every shadow in the long corridors seemed to stretch and twist into menacing shapes. Every slammed cell door sounded like a gunshot aimed at me. I was walking around with a secret that could bring down the entire prison administration, and the weight of it was physically crushing. The first sign that they knew I was onto them was subtle, almost deniable. I was on my standard rotation in C Block when my name crackled over the radio, calling me for a random locker inspection in the staff wing. But the two officers conducting it weren't regular grunts. They were desk jockeys from the administrative wing, guys I barely recognized. And they weren't just searching. They were tearing my locker apart with a focused intensity, dumping my personal belongings on the floor, running their fingers along every seam. They were looking for the papers from Maria. Luckily, my paranoia had served me well. I had spent a lunch break making copies, which were now nestled safely in a safe deposit box 2 towns over. The originals were hidden in a place no one would ever think to look. They found nothing but my spare uniform and a dog-eared paperback, but the message was received loud and clear. "We're watching you. We can get to you any time we want." Then the psychological games started. An anonymous complaint was filed against me with Internal Affairs, alleging favoritism toward an inmate. It was baseless, a complete fabrication, but it triggered a formal inquiry. I had to spend 2 excruciating hours getting grilled by 2 stone-faced investigators who treated me like a suspect, picking apart my 15-year service record. The complaint was eventually dismissed for lack of evidence, but the process was designed to be humiliating, a stark reminder that my career, my pension, and my reputation could be shredded on a whim. The real threat, though, the one that made my blood run cold, came from the men in orange jumpsuits. One afternoon, as I was walking the tier, an inmate, a lifer with cold, dead eyes and a reputation for violence, stepped directly in front of me, blocking my path. It was a clear breach of rules, an act of overt defiance. "You've been asking a lot of questions, officer," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was more felt than heard. "Talking to people you shouldn't. Some friendly advice?" "Stop." My hand instinctively went to my radio on my belt, but I didn't press the button. This wasn't a random act of inmate defiance. This was a message, delivered by a proxy. "Is that a threat?" I asked, my own voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the fear coiling in my stomach. He smiled, a chilling, joyless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "It's a weather forecast. There's a storm coming, and you're standing right out in the open." He then simply stepped aside and walked on as if nothing had happened, melting back into the population. I was no longer just an officer. The money that was flowing through the prison was buying more than just contraband. It was buying loyalty, creating a private army of enforcers willing to do the bidding of their unseen paymasters. I wasn't investigating a crime anymore. I was a target inside my own workplace. That night, I felt completely and utterly trapped. The thick concrete walls of the prison weren't just for keeping the inmates in anymore. They were closing in on me. I thought about dropping it all. Just walk away. Who could I even go to? The warden. He was either in on it or so clueless he was useless, and I didn't know which was worse. Go to the state police? To the FBI? I was just a corrections officer with a wild conspiracy theory and a handful of illegally obtained documents. They'd laugh me out of the building. For a moment, I almost gave in. I sat in my small, empty house and seriously considered burning the evidence, forgetting everything, and just going back to being a guard. It would be the safe thing to do. The sane thing to do. But then I thought about the look on Deputy Warden Evans' face. The look of a man who had sold his soul and was now living every second in a private hell of his own making. I thought about my 15 years, a career I had, for the most part, been proud of, now stained by the rot I had uncovered. If I backed down now, if I let them intimidate me into silence, I'd be just like them. Complicit. Broken. Part of the problem. That was a line I couldn't cross. I was running out of time and options. The threats were escalating, becoming less subtle with each passing day. I had only one card left to play, and it was a wild card. Deputy Warden Evans. He was the weak link in the chain. The visceral fear I had seen on his face that day in the conference room was my only leverage. He wasn't the master of this conspiracy. He was its most high-profile prisoner. My plan was born of desperation. It was crazy, reckless, and could get me killed. I was going to confront him directly. Not to accuse him or threaten him, but to do the one thing they would never expect. I was going to offer him a way out. I cornered him in his office late one night, long after most of the administrative staff had gone home. I knocked once on the heavy oak door and walked in without waiting for an answer. He looked up from a pile of paperwork, startled, his face immediately clouding over with suspicion and hostility. "Mark, what is it? It's late." "We need to talk, sir," I said, closing the door firmly behind me. I walked across the plush carpet and stood directly in front of his massive desk, a deliberate invasion of his space. "About what?" he asked, his voice sharp with authority, but his eyes betrayed his nervousness. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I reached into my jacket, and for a second, I saw him flinch. I slowly pulled out a single sheet of paper and laid it on his desk. It was a copy of one of the programmatic reallocation forms. His signature was at the bottom, glowing under the light of his desk lamp, clear as day. He stared down at the paper, and just as before, all the color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy gray pallor. It was that look again, the one that had started it all. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "That's not important," I said, keeping my voice even and calm. "What's important is that I know. I know about the money, the fake accounts, the ghost vendors. I know about Thorne and Silas Black. I know Silas is using a network of inmate accounts to launder the kickbacks from the funds you're embezzling." He didn't deny it. The fight just seemed to drain out of him. He slumped back in his expensive leather chair, a man utterly defeated. "You have no idea what you're involved in," he breathed, staring at nothing. "Then tell me," I pressed, softening my voice slightly. "Sir, I'm not here to jam you up. I've known you for a long time. A man like you, a man who came up through the ranks, doesn't just throw away a career for money. They have something on you. They're blackmailing you." He dropped his head and stared at his hands on the desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was cracked and hollow, the voice of a ghost. "It started years ago. A mistake I made when I was younger, a different post. A stupid, terrible mistake. I thought it was buried, forgotten. But they had proof. Pictures. They held onto it for years. When the time came, when they needed someone with signature authority to make this whole thing work, they played their card." "Who's they?" I asked, my own voice now a near whisper. He shook his head, a gesture of profound despair. "It's bigger than Thorne. It's bigger than Silas. They're just mechanics, functionaries. The architect is someone you would never suspect. Someone with real, untouchable power. They needed me. It was either play along, sign the papers, or my career, my pension, my whole life was over. They would have destroyed me and my family. So I played." He looked up at me then, his eyes pleading, stripped of all authority. "This whole scheme, it's a monster. It's a cancer, and it's eating this prison from the inside out." This was it. The confession. The crack in the dam. "Help me," I said, my voice firm again, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. Help me stop them. You can't live like this, looking over your shoulder every second. Cooperate. With what I have and your testimony, you become the key witness. You could get immunity." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Immunity? Walk away. There's no walking away from these people. They will crush you. They will erase you." "They're already trying," I said pointedly. "I've been threatened by inmates. My locker has been tossed. The only way out for both of us is through them. You have to make a choice, Evans. Right now. Are you going to go down as the man who helped them loot this state, or the man who helped bring them down?" He was silent for a long minute, his gaze fixed on his own signature on the form, the symbol of his downfall. Then he looked at me, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, the raw fear in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else. A spark of defiance. "There's someone," he said, so quietly I had to lean in. "Someone on the outside. The Regional Director of Corrections. Director Monroe." My heart leaped. Director Alan Monroe had a reputation as a hard-nosed, by-the-book reformer. He was ex-military, famously incorruptible. He was untouchable. "Monroe is the only one with the power to launch a real investigation that can't be squashed from the inside," Evans continued, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "If I go to him, with you and your evidence, maybe he'll listen. If anyone can fight this, it's him. Maybe he's our only shot." He finally pushed himself up from his chair, a decision made. "Get me everything you have. All of it. We're going to see Director Monroe. And may God help us all." Leaving his office, I felt a dizzying surge of adrenaline and triumph. I had done it. I had turned him. I had found an ally in the heart of the conspiracy. The walls weren't closing in anymore. I was about to tear them down. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. It was a foolish, naive hope, and it was about to cost me everything. 2 days later, I was sitting in a sterile, featureless conference room at the regional headquarters. The air smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and weak coffee. Across the polished table sat Deputy Warden Evans, looking haggard and sleep-deprived, but resolute. At the head of the table sat Director Alan Monroe. He was an imposing figure, with a shock of silver hair, a perfectly pressed suit, and cold, intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through you. He listened intently, without interruption, as Evans and I laid out the entire conspiracy, from Thorne's visits to the money orders to the embezzlement scheme. I was the one who did most of the talking, walking him through the timeline. I handed Monroe the thick folder containing all my evidence, the copied financial records, the visitor logs, my detailed notes. My entire life's work for the past several months. When we finished, an hour later, the room was silent. Monroe tapped his manicured fingers on the folder. "This is extensive," he said, his voice a low, measured baritone that commanded respect. "You've done a dangerous and remarkable thing, officer. And you," he said, turning his gaze to Evans, "have shown great courage in coming forward. This level of corruption is a cancer, and we will cut it out." The relief that washed over me was so overwhelming it almost brought me to my knees. It was over. We had won. Justice was coming. Monroe told me to take a mandatory leave of absence, effective immediately, for my own safety. "Let us handle it from here," he said, giving me a firm, reassuring handshake. "You've done your part. We'll take the ball across the finish line." The next few weeks were a blur of vindication. News reports began to surface. A major internal investigation at the prison was announced. Evans was publicly suspended pending the outcome. Thorne, the lawyer, was arrested in a dramatic raid on his downtown office. Silas Black was quietly transferred to a supermax facility upstate. It was all happening, just like Monroe had promised. I watched it all from my living room, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment I hadn't felt in years. My mandatory leave stretched from 1 week to 3. I called my direct supervisor, but was told to wait for official word from the director's office. Then, one Tuesday morning, a courier delivered an official letter. My employment with the Department of Corrections was terminated, effective immediately. I stared at the words on the page, my brain unable to process them. Terminated. The letter was cold, clinical, and vague. Gross misconduct. engaging in an unauthorized investigation, violation of the established chain of command. It concluded by stating that my reckless actions had discredited the department and compromised an ongoing official inquiry. Stunned and disbelieving, I drove to the regional headquarters and demanded to see Monroe. His secretary, a woman with a practiced, impenetrable smile, blocked me at the door to his office suite. "The director is unavailable." As I stood in the marble lobby, my world spinning, a news report on the large television screen mounted to the wall caught my eye. It was a live press conference. Director Monroe stood at a podium, flanked by flags, his face a perfect mask of civic duty and solemn authority. "We have successfully dismantled a complex and deeply rooted embezzlement ring within the department," Monroe announced to a sea of cameras and reporters. The mastermind of this shameful operation, Deputy Warden Evans, used his position of trust to defraud the state of millions of dollars. My blood turned to ice in my veins. "Mastermind, Evans," Monroe continued, his voice resonating with gravitas. "Thanks to a tip from a loyal, but now compromised junior officer, we were able to intervene and neutralize the threat posed by Evans and his co-conspirators. They will all face the full weight of the law." And then it hit me like a physical blow, knocking all the air from my lungs. The final, horrifying twist of the knife. I was the compromised junior officer. The mountain of evidence I had so painstakingly gathered to prove Evans was a terrified, blackmailed pawn had been expertly twisted and used to frame him as the kingpin. Thorne and Evans were the perfect scapegoats. Monroe wasn't the savior I had imagined. He was the architect. He was the one Evans had been so terrified of all along. The entire scheme, the siphoned money, fed Monroe's power, his ambition, his control. I wasn't a threat to him. I was an opportunity. The perfect, unwitting tool. I did all the dirty work, gathering the precise evidence he needed to clean his own house. He used my investigation to cut loose his own liabilities, Evans, who was becoming a risk, and Thorne, the visible bagman, and in the process, he got to play the hero who single-handedly cleaned up the department. I didn't hand him a weapon to fight corruption. I handed him the broom to sweep it all under a new rug, with him standing proudly on top. I had been played, expertly and ruthlessly, from the very beginning. The final, bitter irony was that my own relentless, naive pursuit of the truth was the very thing Monroe had used to promote himself, save himself, and utterly destroy me. I walked out of that gleaming, soulless building a broken man. I had lost my career, my pension, my reputation, and my faith in the very system I had sworn a solemn oath to uphold. Evans, the man I tried to save, the man I ultimately condemned, took the fall. I later heard from a former colleague that he was found dead in his cell during the pre-trial detention. An apparent suicide, the official report said. Convenient. I tried to fight it. I went to the press, to the FBI. But without my original evidence, which Monroe now possessed, and with my name officially discredited by the very agency I had tried to help, I was just a bitter, fired guard with a wild, unbelievable story. Nobody listened. Monroe was a celebrated hero, a champion of reform. The cancer wasn't cut out. It had just been given a clean bill of health by the chief surgeon. Looking back, I realized the most important thing in this world isn't always the truth. It's who gets to tell the story. I saw a flicker of fear in a man's eyes and foolishly thought I could be a force for justice. But in a system built on walls, both physical and political, the most dangerous conspiracies are the ones hiding in plain sight, wearing a suit and tie, and smiling benevolently for the cameras. I lost my job, but I refused to lose myself. I walked away with my integrity, and in a world like that, it's the only real currency you have left. The fight isn't over. It's just taken a different form. That's why I'm telling you this story. Because the truth needs a voice, even if it's just one, speaking from the outside.